It is 47 AD, 4 years into the Roman invasion campaign of Britain. Most of southern Britain has fallen, the British hill forts no match for organised Roman warfare. The most powerful northern tribe, the Briganti, has signed up to a non-aggression pact with Rome, and the 3 Roman legions have made bases that stretch across a frontier, defined by the Fosse Way, a Roman road connecting Exeter to Lincoln and a road which is still used today. Conquering Wales, and eventually the north and up into Scotland, would take decades. At the time there was no Wales, Scotland or England. Constructs invented 1,000 years later, it was an island nation of Prydain, united in language and culture, but separated by tribes and rivalry. The 15,000 or so legionnaires were supported by a large contingent of the navy, as well as auxiliaries, light infantry and cavalry, and during the invasion, archers and elephants joined those ranks. These would have been drawn from tribes of the empire, and would acquire Roman citizenship and a pension of land after 25 years of service, and these numbered 15,000 or more. Troublesome Britain swallowed up between 35,000 and 40,000 of the empire's military, about a tenth of the manpower. For more on the role of the auxiliaries, check out my video on Hadrian's War. Emperor Claudius's invasion in 43 was led by Aulus Plautius, and after 4 years of success, Claudius replaced him in 47 with Asturius Scapula as commander and governor. His biggest challenge was Caractacus, also known as Caradoc in the Welsh, who led the Britons, a tribal chief from Essex who retreated to the mountains of Wales to continue the resistance uniting the 2 major tribes, the Siluri in the south and the Ordovici in the north. The Roman writer Tacitus, 30 years after the event, records a description of the final showdown between the now famous Caractacus, king of the Britons, and the might of Rome. The army then marched against the Siluris, a naturally fierce people and now full of confidence in the might of Caractacus, who by many an indecisive and many a successful battle had raised himself above all the generals of Britain. Inferior in military strength, but deriving an advantage from the deceptiveness of the country, he at once shifted the war by a stratagem into the territory of the Ordovici, where, joined by all who dreaded peace with us, he resolved on a final struggle. He selected a position for the engagement in which our advance and his retreat alike would be difficult for our men and comparatively easy for his own, and then on some lofty hills, wherever their sides would be approached by gentle slope, he piled up stones to serve as a rampart. A river too of varying depth was in his front, and his armed bands were drawn up before his defences. A number of locations in Mid-Wales and Shropshire have been proposed, such as this hill fort called Caer Caradoc on the border, although it's some way away from the River Severn. A better candidate is Caer Zeus. There's a site of a campaign fort large enough for a legion, although nothing is visible above the ground now, and large hill fort of Cefn Carnaf overlooking the valley and Severn River. Ardok Roman fort in Perthshire gives a much better idea of the defensive ditches and ramparts, being one of the best preserved forts in Europe, although this is just small at 2 hectares. Within, an architect, meaning chief builder, would organise the legion in their different construction roles. That included ditch diggers and tree fellers, carpenters, road builders, tile makers, as well as cooks and butchers and tradesmen. A legion was a Swiss army knife for skills, as well as soldiering. The commander would have had his tent at the centre, and in campaigns the men would live in tents, arranged in an orderly way with a marshalling area for when they exited. Even though we get the name castle from their camp, or fort, it was a base of operations, the troops leaving in formation to confront the enemy. It's worth noting that marching camps were built at the end of the day by troops, basically a defended campsite with a simple ditch and earth mound. Campaign forts would offer protection whilst carrying out offensive operations in enemy territory, and include more elaborate, semi-permanent structures that may also include timber barricades and a gatehouse, as well as bakeries and latrines. The remains of the fort visible in the village is a large 3.2 hectare one, and probably dates from 25 years later. It would have been barracks for auxiliaries, numbering between 500 and 800, sometimes a mix of infantry and cavalry, and was possibly occupied from about 78 to the end of occupation. It was upgraded in stone, built with imported red sandstone, and this reconstruction in Northumberland of a gatehouse shows just how impressive it would have been. A civilian village or vicus developed around it, although nothing above ground survives. A Roman supply road can be traced out that heads back to Shropshire, passing another fort on the crossing of the River Severn, about half a day's march away, and then on back to Watling Street into what is now known as England. The final showdown was a defeat for Caradoc. He fled north into Briganti territory, asking Queen Cartimandu for asylum. Whether it was just a matter of political diplomacy or another reason, she handed him over to the Romans. Taken to Rome as a trophy of war, he was spared execution after winning over Emperor Claudius with a speech. He lived a life of luxury in exile, forbidden to return, although invited to plenty of parties by the chattering classes. Now, a question I have long asked is how exactly Romans carried out their campaigns, with particular regard to Roman road building, which along with forts were major military infrastructure. A legion numbered up to 5,000, and they'd be supported by another 5,000 auxiliaries. This force needed feeding and a logistical supply route, as well as a route for escape if things got out of hand. In the 7 years of initial occupation, as we have seen, bases were established, with temporary camps being turned into permanent ones by the legionnaires themselves. During that period, roads were upgraded to full metalled highways, connecting forts and towns, and these were exclusively built by the military. Wales was quite different even in medieval times and earlier to what we see today. The bald hills are a consequence of modern farming methods. They would have been wooded, and some of the valleys would have been marshland. However, the population was not insignificant, as Tacitus affirms. This was not entirely a wilderness, but it was a lot less easy to traverse. So the question is, how did the legion move into virgin territory? Did they establish camps and then build new roads? Did the roads come after they had established bridgeheads into the territory, or only after the territory was conquered? Sadly, the Roman writers don't tell us. However, a supposed Roman road was discovered just south of Shrewsbury, surfaced and wide enough for carts to pass each other, although it turned out to be an older Celtic road. It appears the British had a highway network to trade between regions. Watling Street, which was the main Roman highway between Shrewsbury and Dover, was a busy trade route and surface road in Celtic times. This suggests that the military used existing roads, and Britain was probably more civilized than we imagine. After the defeat of Caractacus, the Silures continued to harass Roman troops, supposedly after Asturias had publicly said that they posed such a danger that they should be relocated or completely exterminated. A large legionary force occupied in building forts in Silurian territory was surrounded and attacked, and only rescued with difficulty and considerable loss. The Siluri had been galvanized, at least according to Tacitus, by Asturias's ill-thought-out threats, and in return they had taken Roman prisoners as hostages and distributed them amongst other neighbouring tribes. Wales was united. In 52, Asturias died unexpectedly. He was replaced by Didius Gallus. He sought to defend the territory rather than expanding into Wales. With the resistance of southern England largely over, the 20th Augusta Legion at Exeter was moved up to Usk in 55. Incidentally, Exeter derives its name from the river, the Axe, which derives from the Celtic Usk, and they simply mean full of fish. Nothing remains of the fortress at Usk, which was a full legionary fort capable of housing over 5,000 men, and possibly as many auxiliaries. The fort was about 20 hectares in area, made of earth and wood. The maid roamed through the fort, roughly following the modern Maryport Street. About the same time, the Legion of the 14th Gemini moved their base up from Manchester in Warwickshire to Roxeter, just south of Shrewsbury, along Watling Street. The ruins we see are part of the bathhouse and gymnasium complex that date from when the fort was turned over for civilian use. Tacitus hints that these years were dark times for the Romans, and he even mentions the defeat of a legion, and the Siluri in particular waging a guerrilla war into Roman-occupied territory. Quintus Veranius became governor of Britain in 57, under Emperor Nero, who succeeded his father, Claudius, in 54. He reversed Didius's policy of maintaining existing borders and began military operations against the troublesome Silures, but died within a year. In his will, he flattered Nero and claimed that if he'd had another 2 years, he would have conquered the whole island. He was replaced by Suetonius Paulinus. Suetonius had served in North Africa in now modern Morocco and suppressed mountain tribes, perhaps being specially selected with Wales in mind. The next incursion, around 60-61, into Wales is perhaps the most famous, and the adventure is described by writer Tacitus. On the shore stood the forces of the enemy, a dense array of arms and men, with women dashing through the ranks like furies, the Druids pouring forth dire curses with their hands uplifted towards the heavens, striking terror into the soldiers. Evidence for a powerful priesthood of Druids is lacking, as indeed any evidence that Anglesey was a centre of Druidic influence. Julius Caesar, writing a century before, mentions the Druids, and in the spirit of a civilizing force conquering savages, he portrays the Druids as a barbaric religion that needed to be wiped out, which would have been lapped up by the citizens of Rome. Caesar, in writing about the Gauls and Britons, is self-promoting and unreliable, describing mythological beasts of the German forests as fact. And given the barbarity of the Roman circus, it's obviously hypocritical to be so shocked with prisoners and criminals being burned in a wicker man. Caesar does comment that Druids got their training in Britain, and alludes that they, in turn, also received their training in Ireland. Despite many books on the subject, we don't actually have much information on who the Druids were. In later Dark Ages and medieval period, Ireland and Wales have a social class that is effectively the intelligentsia: poets, historians, doctors, lawyers, and the clergy. Suetonius's operation to invade Anglesey could have been based on simply misunderstanding what their spies and scouts were telling them. In the first instance, it is worth knowing the Roman army gathered intelligence, either to be prepared against an attack or to embark on a major operation. Tacitus says the operation is to eliminate a major hotbed of resistance, and that may be true. Anglesey or Mons may have been a bolt hole. It may have had simple communities with very powerful men and women plotting the resistance to Rome. Alternatively, it seems that the aristocracy of Celtic tribes sent their children off for an education. Fostering children in their teens appears to be a common practice, with a reference to the shame of fathers seeing their son in the years between the end of childhood and adulthood. Perhaps they were taught in forest academies, perhaps in Anglesey, possibly further afield in Ireland. What is clear is there is no great town or citadel on the island. It was, and is, lush. It was a breadbasket in medieval times, and Edward I specifically launched an invasion into the island to secure the grain supplies and try and starve out the Welsh rebels. Conquest of Anglesey was famously cut short by Boudicca's rebellion, who used the opportunity of the Legion away to sack Colchester, London and St Albans. Over the following decade, 3 governors took office, the 60s being generally uneventful, in Britain at least. The final year was civil war. In 69, Vespasian became emperor. In 71, Carillus was appointed governor of Britain, and bringing an additional legion, the second Euditrix. He was supported by Agricola, commander of the 20th Valeria Victrix, and they replaced the Germania, who were relocated to the Rhine. Carillus was mainly occupied subduing rebellious northerners, the Briganti and their allies. After Carillus' term of service, Julius Frontinus was appointed in 73 and set about subduing Wales, 30 years after the fall of southern Britain. Caerleon became the new headquarters of the Legion of the Second Augusta from about 75, and it was their home for 225 years. the old base at Usk being demolished, and Cillian was better positioned, having a tidal river of the Usk offering a supply route. Diva Victric, the Roman fortress at Chester, indicated construction there was probably underway about the same time, with the legion of the 20th Valeria Victrix at Wroxeter being moved up and the old fortress being turned over for civilian use, and Britain's fourth largest city. It is during Vespasian's reign and his descendants, Titus and Domitian, who make up the Flavian dynasty, that sees a 10-year campaign waged against the Welsh tribes. Caerwent is a hidden gem. It was founded by the Romans in about AD 75 as a market town for the defeated Silures. This is confirmed by an inscription on the Civitas Silurium stone now on display in the parish church. As you can see, large sections of the Roman town walls are still in place, and they rise up 5 metres, although these stone walls were built sometime later, replacing timber ramparts. Julius Frontinus was certainly an interesting choice for governor. He had military experience in conquest, but he was also an engineer with expertise in aqueducts. He pushed right into Wales and pacifying the south and mid-Wales, and also pushed west to take control of the gold mines. And once taken, set about upgrading the facilities to increase production, which included aqueducts in the processing of gold. The whole operation was run by the military for the duration of the occupation. The drift mines are accessible to the public, and those tool marks date from the Roman period. The dangers of mining meant the hard work was carried out by convicts and prisoners of war. Welsh gold mining was very productive, or having a much higher gold content than modern mines. And the Romans would certainly have been aware of their existence prior to any invasion. Wales also had iron, silver, copper and lead. Here's an interesting thing by absence. South of Exeter and on into Cornwall, Roman remains are almost non-existent. There's no invasion, yet Cornwall was rich in copper and tin and even some gold, and whilst bronze was less important than it was in the Bronze Age, the empire had plenty of uses for tin, and Cornwall, it seems, was still the major source of tin for the whole of Europe. It appears the businessmen, or women of Cornwall, carried on as usual, trusted by Rome to carry on doing what they had done for thousands of years. Accurate weights and measures, and no cheating, was part of Roman culture and law. These large lead ingots come from northeast Wales in standardised Roman form, with the tribal name stamped on each. Clearly, the Silures who had control of the mine were not complying with peaceful trading, and any wealth they raised certainly was not going to the Roman economy. Which begs the question, why did Rome wait so long, 30 years to seize control of such an important asset? There's no obvious answer. Perhaps governors were simply busy and thrown by the death of Asturias in 52, who had probably conquered Wales. The rich resources of Wales led to a sizable presence of troops and numerous military bases. This is Roman Moridunum, modern Carmarthen, with the invasion pushing west into Dementia territory, again in 75. The smaller tribe occupying what is now known as Pembroke, and they don't appear to have put up much of a resistance, as, a few years later, the fort was abandoned and the tribal town was built based on a Roman grid system, complete with walls and amphitheatre, and one of only 7 in Britain, and one of only 2 in Wales, along with Caerleon. The town survived into post-Roman Britain, mentioned by Nennius as Castle Vortigern, the mythical Dark Age king who made an unfortunate pact with the Anglo-Saxons. With Britain having 15,000 legionnaires, possibly 20,000, and as many auxiliaries, and dozens of forts being constructed in Wales in this period, it seems the bulk of the military in Britain were stationed in Wales. With the Siluri conquered and a network of forts and Roman roads established, the next governor, Agricola, who had served in Britain commanding the 20th Valeria Victrix Legion, and after spending 3 years governing Aquitaine in Gaul, returned to Britain in 77. He had discovered that the Ordovisi of the North Wales had virtually destroyed a Roman cavalry unit stationed in their territory. He immediately moved against them and defeated them. His campaign then moved on into Anglesey, where Tacitus is keen to point out he subjugated the entire island of Mons. The church overlooking the modern Holyhead harbour sits inside a small stone-built Roman fort, built to defend the Roman harbour, and there is little else on the island, perhaps a lighthouse on Holly Mountain. The major benefit to the Roman economy was control of two major copper-producing areas. Here in Anglesey, that was greatly expanded in modern times, and this is Great Orme, that had been producing copper from the earliest Bronze Age period. 2 years later, Wales had quietened down enough for many of the garrisons to be relocated to northern Britain in readiness to invade and conquer Caledonia. Life in Wales settled down to trade and the Roman way of life. Tymenimur was probably built to maintain Roman authority over the era following Agricola's campaigns. The fort, which was first built with raised earthworks and timber, probably housed a cavalry unit of between 500 to 1,000 men. In the early 2nd century, around about 110, the fort's personnel was reduced in size and rebuilt in stone to accommodate 500 infantry. The rebuilding work suggests the military situation was stabilizing and that soldiers had settled down into a purely garrison role. So much so that roughly 30 years later, the fort was abandoned. There's a small section of reconstructed wall, and the mound you see is a Norman bailey built 1,000 years later. With a quiet life on the most western edge of the empire, the soldiers were occupied doing practice camps, and there was also a parade ground. In times of peace, keeping the troops occupied was a priority. He did not want them following the commander or governor into a civil war to fight to become emperor. A little further south, near the village of Stranethurnet, the Roman road of San Helen can be made out crossing fields. Along the borders of modern Wales, a major highway connected the cities of Chester, Rochester, Kenchester, and eventually on down to Caerleon. About halfway is Lenwardine. It was established as part of the 55 campaign. This was superseded with a supply fort at Praetorium. It's 1 mile southeast of Lenwardine, on the top of Brandon Hill, occupying a corner of a much larger hill fort, and it's believed that the fort contained a storage depot, regimental HQ, latrines, cookhouse, and dates from the Claudian period. Praetorium originally meant the commander's tent when the legion was on campaigns, but it also became to mean a palace for military officials. A permanent garrison was relocated back to the west of the town at Jay Hill and rebuilt in stone sometime in the early 2nd century. The subsurface remains are well preserved and visible as crop marks. It's about 2 hectares, and the town itself became a service station with travel lodges and other associated businesses. The town had its own tiny little museum. Lenwardine was a mansio. It comes from the Latin to remain or stay, and was an official stopping place on the Roman road, and maintained by the central government for the use of officials and those on official business whilst travelling. The village also had a bathhouse. The construction of the ramparts occurred around 170 AD. 170 may relate to uprisings in the north. It could possibly purely be a precautionary measure or an indication Welsh tribes were equally revolting. The road led south to Magnus, now Kenchester, to the west of Hereford. There's little to see, although the hedge line roughly follows the hexagonal town walls. It's a Roman-British town and an important market centre for the British Debunny tribe. The wall's construction in earth is dated to 120, when the Hadrian was active in civilizing tribes by building them Roman towns, and the walls were replaced with stone late by the 4th century. It remained a citadel for the British in post-Roman times, part of the King of Powys, until the Anglo-Saxons seized it as their base sometime in the 6th century. Further south are the ironworking area of the Forest of Dean. Puzzle Woods, famed for its fantastic landscape and used in film and TV such as Doctor Who and Star Wars The Force Awakens, although you can avoid the hefty admission fee and explore neighbouring workings along footpaths. Iron, of course, was a core raw material to run the empire and the military machine. Britain was probably self-sufficient for Roman and domestic needs. Although Puzzle Wood is just over the border in England, there is evidence of ironworking in the rich iron landscape of South Wales. Even Merthyr Tydfil had a Roman fort located beneath the football grounds, which in turn were built over the manor house of a later iron baron. Cardiff had a small auxiliary fort built during the 55 campaign, but it was quickly abandoned. Another fort followed 20 years later in the 75 campaign, with a civilian settlement and iron production centre growing up around it. The military probably left a decade or so later, but they were to return in AD 287. The admiral of the Roman Channel Fleet, Carisius, declared himself Emperor of Britain and Northern Gaul, and started to mint even his own coins. In AD 293, he was assassinated by his treasurer, who quickly started to work on his palace in London to solidify his claim to authority, and also started to build the famous Saxon shore forts along the coast of Britain, both to strengthen defences against the Germanic tribes to the east, but also to prevent Rome from sending a fleet to recover Britain for the empire. A 3.5-hectare shore fort was built to guard against pirates. It was similar to the Porchester Saxon shore fort that was repurposed by the Normans as a curtain wall for a castle. Likewise, the Norman castle at Cardiff originally used the Roman walls, and some of the original masonry can be found, although in this case the castle was extensively restored in the 19th century. In 296, the Roman Empire recaptured Britain. The legion at Caerleon appears to have been briefly relocated to Cardiff in 300, and they were then redeployed to Kent and to the original invasion site, another Saxon shore fort, Risborough. By now, the threat was not British but Saxons, the Irish and the Picts raiding Britain. In the winter of 367, the Roman garrison of the Hadrian's Wall apparently rebelled and allowed Picts from Caledonia to enter Britain. Simultaneously, the Scots and Saxons also landed in what might have been a coordinated and prearranged wave of the island's midwestern and southeastern borders. The entire western and northern areas of Britannia were completely overwhelmed, the cities sacked, and the civilians murdered, raped, and enslaved. However, this was short-lived. In the spring of 368, Theodosius arrived and restored order. The commander and governor, Magnus Maximus, a Galatian, a region located on the Atlantic coast of northern Spain, was assigned to Britain in 380. He defeated an incursion of the Picts and Scots in 381. In 383, he was proclaimed emperor by his troops and went to Gaul to further his ambition, confronting and defeating Gratian, the emperor of the Western Empire. His reign of emperor of the West lasting only 5 years. Magnus may have governed Britain from Chester, yet had grown into a significant city, and certainly the Welsh bards remembered and recorded Magnus, with the Welsh considering Chester as a British city given that they carried on the tradition for centuries, despite the city falling into first Saxon and then Norman control. Magnus, in his battles in Gaul, took most of the army, leaving the British to defend themselves, and the Welsh tradition holding that he married a Briton, or rather a Welsh woman, with the later Welsh princes of Mid and North Wales claiming direct descent in the medieval period, by which time Magnus's possible base of Chester, Roman city and legionnaires' garrison, had become instead centred on a small Roman fort at Carnarvon. Segontium, on the outskirts of Carnarvon, was founded by Agricola in 77 or 78 after he conquered the Ordovisi. Originally bigger to garrison 1,000 auxiliaries, probably from German tribes, it was reduced in size by 120 for a garrison about half the size, although upgraded in stone and probably part of Hadrian's strengthening of the empire's borders. Its current size, a further reduction in the 3rd century, and mainly to guard against Irish pirates, and lasting to the end of occupation in 400. and it was an important military base and an administrative centre for North Wales, and the town remained important right into the medieval period. Wales embraced the order and unification of Rome, yet continued to retain its language, myth and culture, with the difference that the non-literate tribes had now adopted writing. The country now entering the post- or sub-Roman period, and it's also known as the Dark Ages or the Age of Arthur. By 400, Britain was left to defend themselves. The legions had left, although Britons considered themselves to be Roman citizens, although the military and Saxon mercenaries were less than disciplined. By the end of the 4th century, Britain was fragmenting into local kingdoms, with Saxons occupying lands in the east of the country. Through to 570, Anglo-Saxons made further advances west. British control was about half the country. In the 540s, there were 2 years without a summer, and possibly 2 further global cooling events caused by volcanic activity, or even atmospheric dust loading by the debris tail of a close proximity comet, which certainly would explain Welsh myths of fighting dragons, and there is speculation that the population rapidly decreased, perhaps through plague coming from the east. The Plague of Justinian was the first major outbreak of the first plague pandemic, and globally around 100 million may have died, and Britain's population of 3 million may have halved. This structure is named after Offa, the Anglo-Saxon king of Mercia, from about 757. The dike is about 20 metres wide in places and includes a mound which is 2.5 metres high, and it was constructed using Roman techniques, which makes it unusual, especially given it would supposedly be the work of Anglo-Saxons. It seems the ditch was a number of earlier shorter lengths that was made continuous during Offa's reign, and some of the ditches predate Offa's reign, dating from 430 to 650. So perhaps these were boundary markers between the kingdoms of Powys and Mercia, with the Roman Britons on one side and the Anglo-Saxons on the other, and for 1,500 years it has pretty well defined the Welsh border. The Roman Conquest of Wales is documented historically. Rome turned up, it veni vidi vici, it came, it saw, it conquered, and it wrote a little bit about that process, but much of the detail is missing. We can make some inference. Somewhere in the region of 20,000 or more troops were required to subdue the Welsh tribes over a decade. In the Flavian period, a huge number of troops were required to garrison the conquered territory. Yet, within a generation, the tribes settled into a new normal, doing pretty much the same things they had done before. This citadel in North Wales, occupied in pre-Roman periods, was reoccupied and expanded, despite Rome imposing a ban on hill forts and tempting tribes into the towns and lowland settlements. The tribes took what they wanted from the empire, trading, writing, a little bit of Latin, formalizing laws and adopting governance and religious organization, but also retaining a distinct identity. The original British tribes of the Siluri, the Ordovisi, the Dementi, surviving as kingdoms into the medieval period, who over 400 years as Roman Britons evolved into the foundations of the modern Welsh nation.